Welcome to Jackson Lewis's podcast, We Get Work. Focused solely on workplace issues, it is our job to help employers develop proactive strategies, strong policies, and business-oriented solutions to cultivate an engaged, stable, and inclusive workforce. Our podcast identifies issues that influence and impact the workplace and its continuing evolution, and helps answer the question on every employer's mind: how will my business be impacted? Accommodation requests for mental health issues are on the rise. Even though these types of disabilities might not be outwardly apparent, employers must address requests for mental health accommodations in the same way they would evaluate and potentially accommodate any disability as legally required. On this episode of We Get Work, we explore how employers can effectively engage in the interactive process to ensure employees struggling with mental health concerns can remain productive members of the workforce. Our hosts today are Sepideh Rofugar, co-leader of the California Advice and Counsel Resource Group, and Joanne Lambert, principals, respectively, in the San Francisco and Orlando offices of Jackson Lewis. Sep and Joanne, the question on everyone's mind today is, what steps can employers take right now to remain ADA compliant when addressing employees' requests for mental health accommodations, and how does that impact my business?
Thanks, Alicia. I'm Sepideh Rofugar, and I'm joined today by my colleague, Joanne Lambert. Hi, Joanne.
Hi, Seb.
Thanks for joining me today, Joanne, to talk about accommodating individuals with mental health disabilities. This is an area of the law that I know both you and I have done quite a bit of work in, and it's an area that I think we're both pretty passionate about. I want to kick us off today by starting with a short story about how it is that I got into this space in the first place. For me, I started working in the mental health disability space about 20 years ago now, when I had a client who had an employee who was struggling with schizophrenia. And we did not know that this individual had schizophrenia when he was hired, about a year and a half before the employee started to experience symptoms at work. And through the interactive process, which I can't stress enough, employers really should utilize, we learned about the employee's diagnosis. And unfortunately, in this particular situation, we weren't able to come up with some accommodations that would really enable this person to remain employed with the employer. But we were able, through leave, a lot of patience, a lot of working with his representative, who was his brother, help get to a place where everybody, the employer, the employee, and his family felt like the employer had done their part in at least trying to assist this person to the best that we could. It was really one of those things that highlighted for me this really human aspect of what our human resources departments do for employers. And I thought that while it wasn't the outcome that I think everybody would have wanted, it was still a positive process because everybody felt good at the end. And I think that that's such an important part of the interactive process. And when you're dealing with disability-related accommodations that employers sometimes struggle with, right? How to make sure that we get through this process with everybody still feeling good, that people were heard. And I think it's particularly difficult in the mental health space because it's not like a physical disability where you're seeing it. Joanne, what about you? How did you fall into this space, and what are some of the struggles that you see that employers have?
Thanks, Seb. I think too that just along the way somewhere, after doing this for 30 plus years, scary to say out loud, that we just started to get more and more employers calling and needing help with these kinds of accommodations, because one of my children has neurodivergency. And my son taught me that word, by the way, because I am simply a lawyer. I'm not a doctor. But, these are new things for all of us to learn. And, if you do have someone in your life that has some of these issues, you might have some small insight, but a lot of people don't, especially in the workplace. So I think that there was just an increase and a rise in, we've got this employee who says they have a learning disability, or this employee who has OCD or ADHD. And, we get that, but we still need them to do their job. Do we have to accommodate these things? So I guess that the answer to that is, I got into it because they started to increase their request. I became more passionate about it, if you will, and more attuned to it because I have someone that I love who has some of these issues, which helps me see the other side. I think it's part of our job as employment attorneys who specialize in this space to help employers get their head around this. Because I think you said it, Sep, these conditions, they're not usually visible. Some of it sometimes can be, but you can't really touch it. It's not a weightlifting restriction. It's not a standing and sitting. It's not, I can't drive to work. There are sort of these amorphous concepts for a lot of people. And I think it's harder for employers to really get their head around it. And then questions come up, right? Questions like, is this real? Do we have to take their word for it? And the answer is no. Just like any accommodation, you're entitled to some healthcare provider documentation. And then, what do we do with accommodations? You were giving the example, I think, Sep, of your case where as creative as you guys tried to be, you couldn't really come up with anything that could keep that person in the job. One of the first ones I remember was a gentleman who worked in a cubicle farm with a lot of coworkers in a big room, and he had OCD, and his routine every morning was he had to sharpen all of his pencils, and he had to unwrap these throat lozenges that he would suck on during the day, but he had to get them all unwrapped and laid out before the workday started. It was very disruptive because it took like half an hour, and it was very noisy. And the employer was like beside themselves. And I'm like, let's take a step back. What can we do here? It was a really easy fix. Can we let him come in a half hour early, do his routine before anyone else is there, and let him leave a half hour early? And it was like, yeah, no further problems. So, with that, Seth, I'm sure you've had some very interesting accommodations. What are you seeing trending right now in the mental health space for employee accommodation requests?
Well, Joanna, I'm seeing a lot of requests for leave, right? Naturally, people are taking time off to get treatment, to help address their issues, or to take time because they need adjustments to medication happening. And that was one of the things in my original case that I was talking about. We were giving the employee a lot of leave as he was adjusting to medications to see if they would help alleviate the symptoms of his schizophrenia so that he could come back to work. I'm also seeing folks wanting sort of differences in how they receive pieces of information, whether it's they need a lot more detailed instructions or the manner in which instructions are provided. But Joanne, I want to go back to something you said, because I think you said something really important there. And you mentioned this idea of people not being believed, right? Or do we have to believe them? I think one of the areas where employers struggle in this space is because oftentimes the questions that come up or the requests for accommodations when they come up after someone got a negative performance evaluation, right?
Yep.
And right, it's, the person is struggling with making deadlines. The person is already struggling with following directions and instructions. And they've gotten the performance management documentation. And now for the first time, they're saying to the employer, oh, but I have ADHD, or I have anxiety, or I have, some other condition, PTSD, depression. And so I think that employers, really need to take a step back when these requests are coming up in that context. And instead of like sort of a initial, like, is this real, or is this just someone trying to come up with an excuse for why they're poor performing? Because we don't do that when it's a physical disability, right? That's not where we go to when it's a physical disability, is to really take that step back and say, okay, is there something that I could do differently for this person that could help them overcome the particular struggle that they've identified that is impacting their performance? And that's where I always try to ask folks, like, well, we obviously will adjust how we communicate with someone who's hearing impaired. Why wouldn't we make that a communication adjustment for someone who has ADHD and maybe provide more written direction instead of verbal direction all the time? I talked a lot about accommodations that I've seen, but Joanne, I know that one of your specialty areas is dealing with service animals, and I know they can be really important and helpful in the mental health space. So would you tell us a little bit more about your experiences with service animals in the mental health space?
Sure. And service animals are amazing. There's so many things I learn. I learn a new one probably once a month, a new thing that an animal can be trained to help someone with. And, there's the obvious ones. There are site support functions that service animals, calling them assistance animals now is another thing, because there's service animal, there's emotional support animal, there's comfort animal, there's all sorts of therapy animals. But the things that animals can be trained to help people with is really super impressive, especially in the mental health space. And so when this concept of emotional support animal was starting to, again, like that was ramping up. So first with service animals, it was the physicality assistance you would see. And then I would say probably in 2010-ish, maybe a couple years later, you started to see this emotional support animal concept coming up. And largely because you started seeing people fly on airplanes with their emotional support animals. And the Fair Housing Act, provides for, you have to allow people in a pet-free housing place have their emotional support animal. So that kind of started to bleed over into Title I of the ADA, which is what we're talking about today, right? Employment accommodations. And people would get really confused and say, well, if it has something to do with mental health, it's an emotional support animal. No, that's not necessarily true, because there are so many tasks that an animal can be trained to help a person who has a mental health disability to do, which is a service animal. For example, if you have an employee who has post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, the dog, or other animals, but usually going to be a dog, can be trained to go in and clear the room. Like when you watch a cop or procedural show on television or a streaming service, they go in with their weapons drawn and they look in all the closets and they open all the doors and they say, clear. The animal actually performs that function for this person with PTSD and comes back to the person and gives a signal that the room is clear, that it is safe for them to enter this space. And that's amazing that an animal can do that. Another thing that assistance animals can do to help people with mental health disabilities is they can recognize an oncoming panic attack or anxiety attack. They can divert their handler's process and help them back down and not actually have the attack. They can remind their handler to take medication for their mental health disability. They can, soothe their anxiety by actually signals or touching that they might do. This is much more than an emotional support animal. So I know, Seth, you like that, because animals are so interesting. And so tell me about, are you seeing a lot of support animal requests in the workplace? Because I know that I am.
I am. And I will say that this is one of those areas where I do think that employers should really be utilizing their interactive process, right? To be figuring out what are the person's functional limitations and how does the animal in the workplace help them. I know a lot of employers use sort of standardized forms for the interactive process. And I think that can be sometimes difficult and a hindrance to getting the information that you really need in the mental health space, because I find that some of those standardized forms aren't really getting at the questions that we need answered when it's a mental health disability versus a physical health disability. Joanna, what about you? Are you seeing that with the forms as well?
Oh, absolutely. And even when it's the physical health disabilities, I've never been a big fan of having a form that you don't customize. I mean, I get that we need forms, and I know employers, you need the forms. You need somewhere to start with, but that's what it has to be. But when you're talking about engaging in the interactive process with an employee who has advised you they have some sort of mental health issues that they need accommodations for, some of the standard questions on your form are not going to make any sense or have any correlation to finding out what's going on with them, what it is they can and cannot do without an accommodation, and what accommodations might work for them. That's thing number one. Thing number two with forms, especially in the mental health space, is if you don't customize your interactive form to tell the healthcare provider the relevant parts of the job and the work environment as it relates to this employee, the issues they are having, and the accommodations they've put out there, the healthcare provider is not going to be able to give you good information back. And if you don't provide that, I mean, it's bigger than attaching a job description. It's so much bigger, especially with a mental health condition where someone, the doctor needs to understand their work environment. Because what happens when we go to the doctor? You tell your doctor the information and they believe you and they rely on it. They don't sit there and cross-examine you to get all the other information. That's sort of the employer's job. If you want to get good information to make a good decision based upon, and let's face it, later on maybe defend that decision in litigation if you end up there. It's super, super important that you're not using cookie cutter, one size fits all form, especially when it comes to mental health, for sure. And then I'll throw in here too on service animals. That's a whole different world of interactive documents and requests, completely different. Definitely, I've got some templates I put together for that. And every time somebody asks me for it and I open it up, I revise it. I swear I must revise it at least once or twice a month because I think of something better, a better way to express something, or I've encountered an accommodation situation that I should add that here. So yeah, I'm not a huge fan of forms. How about you, Sep?
I also am not a huge fan of just sticking to the forms. I agree with you. They should be they do have a place. They are important, but I like to use them as a starting point and getting them tailored for each individual situation. Which I think brings us to how I'd like to close our discussion today, in that I want to share with folks a quote out of a U.S. Supreme Court decision, U.S. Airways versus Barnett, that I think really stresses what the whole purpose behind the Americans with Disabilities Act is, and is very important in the mental health disability accommodation space. In this decision, Justice Breyer says, now retired Justice Breyer says, the statute referring to the ADA seeks to diminish or eliminate the stereotypical thought processes, the thoughtless actions, and the hostile reactions that far too often bar those with disabilities from participating fully in the nation's life, including the workplace. These objectives demand unprejudiced thought and reasonable responsive reaction on the part of employers and fellow workers alike. They will sometimes require affirmative conduct to promote entry of disabled people into the workforce. They do not, however, demand action beyond the realm of the reasonable. And really that opening part of it, this idea of trying to diminish or eliminate stereotypical thought processes and thoughtless actions and hostile reactions, I think is incredibly important when you're dealing with mental health disabilities, because I think we're always striving to remove some of the stigma that attaches to mental health disabilities, and helping to encourage employees to more openly talk about it will enable employers to better be able to come up with creative solutions to help keep people productive members of the workforce. That's what I think the whole purpose of the ADA is about, is what as employers can we do that's within the realm of reasonableness to help an individual with a disability become or remain a productive member of the workforce.
Absolutely. Sep, I love that quote. And I think that really does encapsulate everything that we're talking about here today. And with that, we'd like to thank you both on behalf of Sep and I for joining us today. Glad you could hop on, and please be sure to tune into and follow Jackson Lewis's We Get Work podcast. We have all sorts of exciting new content coming up in the future for you to listen to. Thanks.
Thank you for joining us on We Get Work. Please tune in to our next program, where we will continue to tell you not only what's legal, but what is effective. We Get Work is available to stream and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Libsyn, SoundCloud, Spotify, and YouTube. For more information on today's topic, our presenters, and other Jackson Lewis resources, visit jacksonlewis.com. As a reminder, this material is provided for informational purposes only. It is not intended to constitute legal advice, nor does it create a client-lawyer relationship between Jackson Lewis and any recipient.